the 5th Annual Graduate and Postdoctoral Research Symposium. We have a full day of event programming and presentations for you to enjoy, so we hope that you can remain here throughout the day, culminating in a reception with food and awards at 6 p.m. So our first event is our keynote presentation, and I'd like to welcome the Dean of the Graduate School and the Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs, Dr. Willie Prado, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Tiffany. Good afternoon, everybody. Try one more time. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Much better. See, you all have been here all this time. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully, many of you will be able to stay throughout the day. Thank you to our courageous students who will be presenting posters, oral talks, TED-like talks throughout the day. We are here to celebrate you, not to judge you, although there will be a competition at some point during the day. Also like to acknowledge our faculty, our provost who is here, and our keynote speaker, who when I reached out to him a few months ago, he immediately said, yes, I'll be there, absolutely, it's my alma mater. So let me introduce to you Dr. Len Pinchuk, who has a bachelor's degree from McGill University in from Montreal, Canada. I remember the year you graduated because it's the year that I was born, Len. He graduated from the University of Miami with a doctoral degree here in biomedical engineering. And so we always talk about transforming lives here at the U. And when I think of Len, I can't think of anybody, literally anybody, that I know that has transformed as many lives as he has. So I'm curious, how many of you have had or know of someone who has ever had a stent? Okay. That's about half the room. All right, maybe a little bit more. Anybody knows anyone or that has had issues with glaucoma? Been diagnosed? All right. So that's about another half of you. I think you've mentioned this publicly. How many have had issues with meniscus? Right, with your meniscus? Yep, okay. Yeah. So if the first two of you, if you have had issues with either knowing somebody that has had stents or glaucoma, then those individuals, or if not yourself, have benefited from the technology that Dr. Pinchuk has developed. He has over 130, well now it's probably 140 perhaps, 150, maybe that's changed. No, not quite 150, all right. 140 plus patents, 100 peer-reviewed publications. He's been the founder of a number of different companies. Really just an incredible researcher, scientist, entrepreneur. And it's someone who I think can serve as a role model for all of us sitting or standing here. So thank you so much, Len, for all that you have done. Not only for biomedical engineering, but for the field of health in general. And we're very lucky to call him our very own. He was inducted to the National Academy of Engineering in 2012, and he also received the highest honor that a biomedical engineer can receive from the National Academy of Engineering. With that said, I can continue with an introduction for another 10-15 minutes, I'm sure, but I will be taking up his precious time, and I'm sure you'd rather hear from him than from me. And so with that said, you can please help me welcome to the stage Dr. Len Pinchuk.
Thank you very much for the kind words. I want to start by first acknowledging Dean Eisbrook, who's here. He was Dean when I was a student. He's been an investor just about all my time. And I saw the Provost Dirk is here somewhere too. Oh, good to see you again. And thank you to everybody for coming here. Let's see if this works. Okay, I'm going to talk about the three-legged stool of innovation. And why a three-legged stool? It's a design constraint that I once learned, that a three-legged stool never wobbles. And when you design, you try and design with that in mind. How do you keep it from fluctuating or wobbling? There's a saying I like to use, is never give an inanimate object a choice. And this is what kind of guides a little bit of how we work. Okay, in the beginning. In about 1987, I was a co-founder of Corvida Corporation. Yes, Dr. Einsbrook was the first investor in there. The goal was to develop synthetic arteries to bypass diseased coronary arteries. We used what was called a polyurethane, which was the insulator on pacer leads. So we figured it's being used in the body, let's make it out of this polyurethane. So we spun these porous tubes made out of polyurethane. And this is a scanning electron micrograph. And you see the mesh is roughly 20 micron diameter fibers. There's a human hair cross-section. And we implanted these, but before we implanted it, before we did the explant, I left, I was working at Cordis at that time, and the CEO of Cordis, Norm Einsbrook, and I decided to leave to form Corvida. So we left the company, we did our explants, and so we left in 1987. We did our first explant a month later, and we found that we had 100% degradation, 100% failure rate, and we were not financeable. That was before we took your money. Okay, the pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, the optimist the opportunity in every difficulty. So I decided, let's get Cordis into angioplasty, and let's develop our own implantable biomaterial. So let's talk about the first leg of the three-legged stool of innovation. Inventions don't happen in a vacuum. Societal factors are almost always involved. Edison did not all of a sudden invent the light bulb. There are 23, some of them are patents already on glowing filaments before he got started. Alexander Graham Bell has always been challenged by Alyssa Gray's family as being the inventor of the phone. They both filed patents on the same day. Marconi's patents on television were preceded 30 years earlier by Nicholas Tesla. And if you watch programs on the Wright brothers, you'll see everybody in the world was trying to make an airplane. In fact, Orville Wright, when he was 8 years old, was given a toy helicopter. Hard to imagine. But what these people did is they made their inventions practical for anyone to use every day. So the history of inventions, according to Alfred Koiber, is one of an endless chain of parallel instances. And that was important to me because I was accused of inventing the angioplasty balloon, and I knew other people were working on it, and I didn't understand why they made my patent seminal. And when I began to work at Cordis, this was way earlier, I remember him saying, if someone else is not working on the same invention you are, then one of you is not doing their job. So, as I mentioned, I've heard of other people. I knew Charles Goddard had patented angioplasty and stenting in 1967, and I'm talking now, it's 1987. But the concept of blowing up a balloon in the artery or putting a stent in the artery was frightening. They said you're going to get a heart attack, an infarction, or you're going to get dissection in the artery. So nobody really followed through on it. But by 1986, roughly 20 years later, you had people like Stan Levy working at USCI, DuPont actually, John Simpson. This was the horizon. Andreas Grunzig, Julio Palmez working on stents. And this is kind of what I was kind of watching in the distance. But I had a gut feeling that they were using the wrong materials and they weren't going to make it with what they were using. So let's talk about, trying to remember these names like Simpson and all that's going to come back. So before I go further, and I'm going to go through Polymer Chemistry 101, it's not going to get difficult, but I'm doing that because I once gave a talk and at the end somebody said, what's a polymer? Okay, so I'll connect the dots. Here we have two acid groups, so it's a diacid with an R in the middle. R means these are methylene groups. It's called a diacid. In Latin, unit is mer, so we have one unit here. If you have one unit, it's monomer. And here you have a base. This is a diamine, or dibasic, and that will be monomer 2. In organic chemistry, we like to write it this way, and we talk about nucleophilic reactions where amines begin to react with acids. And we form this bond over here, called an amide bond. Okay, but if you look on the ends, it doesn't stop there. This is, by the way, 2 units, or a dimer. So your amine can react with another acid, your other amine here with another acid, and you can grow this. This is a trimer. And this keeps on going. And you build it up, it could be 100 units, 1,000 units, 1,000,000 units. And N represents the number of repetitions of that group. And poly in Latin is many. So many mers is a polymer. And this is what a polymer is. And the name of the polymer is named on the bond in the middle. It was an amide, so this will be a polyamide, or synthetic silk. And Carruthers worked on this at DuPont in the late 30s. And according to DuPont lore, he did his work in New York in corroboration with this group in London. And this became known as nylon. Okay. Now, there's many different types of nylon, and they depend on the R and the R prime. If you have 6 R's with the diacid and 6 with the diamine, this is nylon 6, 6. These are machine parts. Nylon 4,4 are stockings and pantyhose. Many of you may remember grandmothers talking about wearing nylons. That's because it was nylon. Nylon 6, power tool cases. Nylon 11, carpet. Nylon string guitar is nylon 11. There's a very interesting nylon called nylon 12, and we're going to dwell on that for a little while. So that's a 12th member ring. It's called cyclofluoroalkyl. Here you have your amide group. So for those of you who take an organic chemistry, you don't really get hoops in nature. If you remember the cyclohexane, the bow form and the chair form. Here too I'm going to show it twisted with the dark lines coming out of the page and the other lines going into the page. So let's move this to the left. In the presence of heat and vacuum, the amide link opens, much like I showed earlier. And you can take another amide and you can react it with the acid. And you can grow this into a huge polymer of thousands of units long. And this is polyurethane, or nylon 12 is called. So, the neat thing about this is you can unfurl that twist. You can orient it. So if you pull the molecule, you see it unfurl. So the big rings unfurled. And of course all of them do, I'm only showing one. So if you extrude nylon 12 and you pull it, here I am pulling it, you're unfurling these chains. And it's not like rubber, it doesn't go back, it's entropy is lost. So we've oriented in the axial direction. We want to do the same thing now in the radial direction, and here what we do is we inflate it with a fluid. And we do that in a hot mold, and we set it and inflate it. If I were to go any further, it will burst. So we developed a method of not only blow molding nylon 12, but we would stretch it and reblow it. So it's called double stretch blow molding nylon 12. And this became the angioplasty balloon. And the part that I was most interested in is the deflated profile. You have to make it really small so you can get it through blood clots in the arteries. But it also has to hold 300 psi. And this was novel, and we wanted it to inflate like a paper bag, not like a latex balloon. So we were able to do this, and I remember showing this to Cordis. Here you see it being pulled back into a delivery catheter. Okay. So what the other people in the horizon were doing, you can best see by looking at a soda bottle. If you step on it, easier to do if you empty it first. You'll see what's called winging. And here you have the hard sections of a soda bottle. That was preventing their catheters that people were making it out of these polyester terephthalates. They couldn't compress it down small enough to make it through the lesion or get it through the guiding catheter to get it to the lesion. So what we did is we went to Cordis and we took one of their balloons they were working on, made out of polyethylene terephthalate, and we said, watch this. We took our balloon, made out of nylon 12, put it through the lumen of theirs, and inflated the balloon larger. And they said they had to own this. So these balloons, they can hold 20 atmospheres, 300 psi. They're roughly 10 micron wall thickness. Your plastic wrap in your kitchen is 12 to 15 microns, so it's thinner, but can hold a lot more force. And we can make them large enough to dilate heart valves if necessary. So the key features were high burst strength, low deflation profile, scratch resistant. They wouldn't, when you put it through a calcified lesion, they wouldn't burst. And they were compliant. You can give it a little bit more diameter in a tapered artery. So there were 19 issued US patents on this technology, and they issued between 1987 and 2000. When you have a good invention, you look to see if the family is being propagated. If it's worth a lot of money, you're going to see many patents for the same invention. Okay, so today there are no other angioplasty materials used. They all, when the patents expired, they all use nylon 12. So it's been an important tool in changing cardiology from a diagnostic field to an interventional field. They make coronary and peripheral angioplasty, stenting, cutting balloon, drug-eluting stents, drug photoballoon, and kyphoplasty, where they blow balloons up in the vertebrae, practical. Hundreds of millions of lives approved, and over $100 billion in revenue. To everybody but the inventors. That's another story. Okay. All right, so we got Cordis into the angioplasty business. So now we had to go on and develop an implantable material. Oh, yeah, I wanted to show this. This is kind of interesting because here we won the National Academy of Engineering at Ohio University 2019 Russ Prize. It's just the world's top bioengineering award. There's no Nobel Prize in engineering. This is as high as it gets. So there were 5 recipients, and 4 of them were world-famous cardiologists, and I was the short one there, which is strange because the other people wore these lead aprons for 30 years. I'm bringing this up because it's, first of all, these are the Horizon people. John Simpson's, the Paul Yack, William Thomas. But I remember, first of all, no one at first knew who I was. But later when they found out who I was, they knew from my patents what I did. And they hated me because it stopped them from producing what they wanted to produce. But it reminded me of engineers who remember this. We all know Neil Armstrong was the first on the moon. But who got him there and back safely? So this is what we're talking about here. Okay, leg 2 is creation, observation, interpretation, and iteration. Most inventions come from hunches and technologists tinkering, not from basic science or researchers chasing hypotheses and sudden breakthroughs. Thermodynamics did not lead to the invention of the steam engine. The steam engine led to the field of thermodynamics. Genius is 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. That was Thomas Edison. And Stephen Leacock, a McGill alumnus of mine, who said, he has this, I'm a great believer in luck. The harder I work, the more I have of it. And believe me, luck sometimes is important. All right, we're going to talk about a material and getting into stent grafts. So we had to fix the polyurethanes. So I inherited the polyether urethanes. This is what the pacer insulators are made of. I knew ether's oxidized, so I said, let's switch it to a polycarbonate. So I patented the polycarbonate urethanes. And Pfizer, in the meantime, had bought our stent graft company. And we were providing polycarbonate urethanes to the industry, and they didn't want the liability, so they wouldn't close the deal unless we sold it. So we sold it at first to a company called Polymer Technology Group in Berkeley, California. They called it Bionate. So remember Bionate polycarbonate urethanes kind of come up again. They were acquired by DSM in the Netherlands, and then the Bayer's division of Covestro bought DSM recently. And it's become a very popular material used in implants, like catheters and you name it. Thermetics makes a version, but they don't allow it for implants because I have the patent covered for implants. So what we did is we took a stent. It's made out of alloy, which is cobalt, chromium, nickel. This was from Elgin, Indiana. It was the mainspring on those old wind-up watches. Many of you here don't know what a wind-up watch is. And we married this self-expanding spring-leg stent to the winders we were making, and we formed what was called the stent graft. So the way that works is we can take the stent graft and we can push it down, put it in a catheter. Catheter is any tube that enters the body. And here you see we're pushing it out, or actually we're holding it stationary and pulling the catheter backward, and it self-expands. So I remember we got a call one day from a surgical unit. There's a lady whose abdominal aorta was punctured in a car accident. That's her renal artery you see on the top. She was bleeding into the abdomen, and they couldn't go in surgically because she would have bled to death. So they asked if they can deploy one of our stent grafts through the femoral artery in the leg. So we let them do that. And here we see in red, this is blood coming through the wall of the stent graft because it's porous. And here you see after 30 minutes, it finally stops bleeding through the wall. And she was able to walk out of there, at the aerosol later. We saved her life. But there's not much of a market for trauma. But there is a huge market for the abdominal aortic aneurysm. This is a ballooning of the aorta that occurs above the iliac arteries and below the renals. You see it circled over there. It's the 13th cause of death in the United States. So we deployed what we call a bifurcated stent. It has two legs. You see the indentation over there. And then in each leg, we deploy another stent. And we can bypass the aneurysm in this manner. I'll just let the other one deploy. And this became a new way of treating abdominal aortic aneurysms. They've done over 1 million cases of this. We never really launched ours because we were purchased by Pfizer. Pfizer sold us to Boston Scientific, who already owned 2 stent graft companies. And we're kind of lucky because this is a bifurcated stent graft implanted. This is what it looks like on X-ray. But we began to see after about 2 years in some explants, we saw this cracking again of the polycarbonate urethanes. So the polycarbonate urethanes are not very stable. There's a slow degradation that occurs over time. And what was happening is when your polyurethane flexes, and you put it in the body, macrophages see it, granulocytes see it, and they lay down on it and they spread out. And they secrete superoxide, hydrogen ion. That's what they do for a living. Small molecules are cleaved off, and it oxidizes the polyurethane. And you get degradation and brittlement and cracking if there's motion. And this is what we were seeing. We're seeing this brittle cracking of the polyurethane. But what was also most annoying were the small molecules who were coming away from it. And they were attracting polymorphic leukocytes, nucleoleukocyte. Then we began to see foreign body giant cells. This is the immune reaction, foreign body reaction, foreign body reaction. And then we see phagocytosis, where cells were engulfing the particles. And the goal was to move them out of the body. And it was annoying because the inflammation reaction was, and the capsule form was really annoying. So I decided one day that we need a new biomaterial. And we need one that won't degrade. So being an organic, the hypothesis was a polymer that is ultra pure, totally inert, and matches the compliance or stretchiness of tissue will not elicit a foreign body reaction. And this is what we set out to prove. And to do that, we had to get rid of all bonds that are cleavable. So we got rid of ethers, esters, amides, urethanes, ureas, carbonates. Labile carbon bonds are interesting. I'll talk about that, and double bonds. The simplest polymer is polyethylene. It's just CH2 over and over again, millions of them in units long. Okay, bring out your macrophages in the body if you implant this. They're going to secrete their superoxide, hydrogen ion. The pH can go as low as 1. It's going to start forming free radicals on the backbone. And every 2 of them pair together, and those of you who've taken organic chemistry know about resonance stabilization. So polyethylene, if you think of a Ziploc bag, you can bend it. There's nothing wrong with polyethylene. But when you have these double bonds, you can't bend it anymore. It becomes brittle. So this is a problem that was discovered because they used to make polyethylene liners on acetabular joints between the artificial hip. So it was metal, and the bearing was polyethylene, and then the shell was metal again. And Steve Kurtz used to publish on how the polyethylene would brittle, and you get wear debris forming there, almost you get tens of grams in a year. So they had to pull all these from the market. Okay, so let's get a little bit more complicated. Now we have polypropylene. So you still, in the presence of macrophages, you have the ability to extract the hydrogen. So here you have your superoxide, you form the free radicals, they're going to pair up with the carbon next to it. You're going to be resonance stabilized, you've got to get that brittle. And sure enough, polypropylene brittles in the body. And again, it shatters if you try and bend it. Yeah, there's lawsuits going on with polypropylene, hernia meshes for that reason. But early on, Gene Goldberg at the University of Florida started publishing on the cracking of the haptics. Haptics are little wires that keep an intraocular lens centered below the iris. Okay, now we're going to go to polyisobutylene. Okay, bring out your macrophages, but your macrophages can't approach the backbone because you have all these methylene groups. I know there's a scale factor of macrophages much bigger than the molecule. But you can't form a free radical next to it because carbon can't support another free radical because it already has 4 bonds. So there's no radical to pair with, and the double bond cannot form. So this doesn't happen. You don't form the free radicals on the backbone of polyisobutylene. I'm just showing the H+ reverting back. I don't know if it ever formed in the first place. So the bottom line is that polyisobutylene cannot oxidize, nor can it embrittle. It is extremely biostable. The problem is that it's a gum. In fact, chewing gum is polyisobutylene. So we've got to convert it now into a usable polymer. And this work was invented really by Joe Kennedy and his team at the University of Akron. And what we do is we synthesize in our lab. We have a lab about 20 miles west of here. We take this molecule, and in the presence of a strong Lewis acid at -80 centigrade, we form a plus charge on each side. So we're going to call that R++. Okay. So it's still at -80. We diffuse in isobutylene gas. It's a gas. It looks like it comes in a propane tank. And we propagate the plus charge. And we can grow this again to any size we want. And now you know what the brackets mean. So we're going to put brackets around here. And this could be 1,000 units long. And we can stop it on a dime. So now we have chewing gum. Now, this is an expensive chewing gum. But if you take chewing gum and you pull it apart, the linear strands slide by each other. There's no reason for them to attach to each other. So what we put on the ends are what we call glassy segments. And the glass is like plexiglass or methyl methacrylate. Anyway, we put these on here in the presence of heat. They find each other and they melt into each other. And then when you cool it, they solidify. So you have these blocks of, we're using styrene here. So we have these blocks of polystyrene, but now we have a rubbery material that is not a gum anymore. So in the lab, we take our polyisobutylene that I showed you before, that you know how to make now, and we put in the styrene, we grow that, and we can grow it as large as we want. The more styrene, the more brittle it becomes. We can adjust the feel of it very easily. There were our brackets again, because you're all experts in polymer chemistry. And on the far left, we have our block of polystyrene. On the far right, we have a block of polystyrene. And in the middle, we have this very springy isobutylene polymer. So we call this polystyrene block isobutylene block styrene, or SIBS for short. And SIBS is one of these revolutionary polymers. And this is what it looks like. More specifically, we have the polystyrenes. So we have the surface of these materials is almost 100% polyisobutylene that cannot degrade. and it shields the inner contents of the material. And the result is a uniquely biocompatible and biostable material. We purify this very, very much. So what happens in the body? You see your sieves flexes. It's still a foreign body, your macrophages come. You know, they take a look at it. Notice they're happier. They secrete their superoxide, but nothing penetrates. So, you know, they kind of say, what are we doing here? So nothing's scattered. So they don't accumulate and they go away. So we don't get these huge capsules around these materials. That's the bottom line there. So we're going to talk about 20 years of it in cardiology. Okay, so this is a lesion, or a blood clot in an artery. We're going to take an angioplasty balloon and we're going to blow it up. And then we're going to deflate the balloon. And I once told students here that it's like a footprint in the snow. And what do you mean by footprint in the snow? Okay, those of you who know what a footprint in the snow is going to explain it to them. Angioplasty fails 40% of the time in 6 months. That was the problem. So we said, let's put a stent in it. So a stent is a metal. We put it on an angioplasty balloon. We blow it up. Then we deflate the balloon and leave the stent behind. By the way, stent comes from a dentist by the name of Dr. Stent, who built wire forms in the mouth in the 1800s. The name is carried forward because it's a wire frame. But stenting fails 33% of the time in 6 months. So there's something else going on. And what was happening was, when you inflate your balloon, you begin to traumatize the smooth muscle cells that are in the wall of the artery. Now, you don't have to be a cardiovascular pathologist to realize that they're unhappy. You just look at their faces. And when they're unhappy, they start to reproduce, and they spin these collagenous webs, and it begins to narrow the artery, and eventually, not always, it shuts it off. So some very clever people began to realize that this is what was happening. And the first people to do something about it were the FISCHELLS. And they postulated that radiation will stop mitosis of muscle cells. Dean is pointing out that he's an investor in a FISCHELL company. Okay. So he implanted, two companies, okay. So he implanted a radioactive stent. Okay. So the radiation keeps the cells from dividing. And he went to almost zero failure rate at 6 months. So us people in industry, we knew that the interventional cardiologist had to bring in a radiation oncologist to implant the stent because interventional cardiologists are not licensed to work with radiation. So they had to split their fee with the radiation oncologist. So we knew if we can kick out the radiation oncologist, we'd have a very happy interventionalist, and he would be supportive of change. So the idea was to put a radiomimic drug on the stent and have it release and go into the wall of the artery. So what are your radiomimic drugs? Well, these are your chemo drugs. So the important ones are paclitaxel, rapamycin, mitomycin C, etc. So how do you get it to the lesion? And you can try this when you get home tonight. You take a white shirt and a bicycle chain and put the bicycle chain on the white shirt. Then remove it. You'll see it leaves a mark behind. So the idea is to put your drug into what's going to transfer. But it had to be a polymer, or something that won't come off in the catheter. So it had all sorts of requirements. Boston Scientific was trying to do this, and I'll show you what happened to them, but they called me in. The properties of the coating, it must conform to the stent and open with it. It couldn't flake off, but you had to solubilize the drug, and it couldn't be soluble in water. Now, they were testing Bionate. As I mentioned, Bionate is one of my previous patents. And I knew that Bionate degrades, and I abandoned it in favor of SIMS. So, if you look at what was happening, there you have your lesion. They were deploying a stent, and the stent was coated with Bionate and the drug paclitaxel. And as I mentioned earlier, here we're just turning on the blood. And Again, smooth muscle cells are not happy. I've always wondered why they look different than the other ones. I think it's a different artery. There they go, spinning their web. And I said, look, just dissect through there. Show me what's going on around the stent struts. So they very carefully dissected through it. And there you see the clotted vessel with the holes where the stent was. Okay, so there are, surrounding each strut, each stent strut, there was a layer of polycarbonate urethane, bionate. And I had them blow up the tissue reaction around there. So you're going to see, as it begins to get larger, you see all these little specks. Those are macrophages scavenging the degrading polyurethane. If they had the dyes I had, you'd be able to see the material. But that's what was happening. So basically, they went from 100% failure rate, and I told them the only thing that's going to stop this is if you move the sieves. So here they implanted sieves in the same porcine model, and at 180 days they got a 100% success rate. And they were able to show that there was no change in molecular weight over time. In other words, there was no measurable degradation. In fact, it's getting a little stronger. And they also showed that there was no significant macrophage activity around there. So this became known as Taxus. Now there's approximately 10 million hearts implanted with Taxus. And all we do is we take sieves in the solvent with the drug packed Taxol, spray it on a rotating stent. I do my own animation, but I couldn't animate it. Stent rotating. It's too difficult. So it was the largest product launch in the history of medical devices. They went to sales of $3 billion in the first year alone. And if you look in Wikipedia under Boston Scientific, the first paragraph says they're best known for Taxus. This really put them on the map. So Boston Scientific, they like you when you do stuff like that. So they offered to finance whatever I did, as long as I don't compete with them in the heart. So, you know, UN graduate, financial genius. I realized you have one heart, but you have two eyes, so you can sell twice as much product. So I went into ophthalmology. Okay, we'll get into that. So let's talk about leg 3. Leg 3 is personality inherited factors. Self-motivation is important, driven by accomplishment is important. Curious mind is important. These are born ventures. Easily inspired. You can recognize those sparks on the horizon I talked about earlier. And these sparks fuel internal sparks. And very important, you have to be an outputter in contrast to an inputter. And I've interviewed engineers who I asked them what they did at night, and they said, well, sometimes Netflix, sometimes Hulu, depending on what's on. And these are your inputters. You put them in quality assurance. They're not going to be your inventors in R&D. You have to be a risk taker, not afraid of failure. You have to be patient, not readily frustrated. And I know personally I'm happy just thinking. People don't understand how I can just be happy thinking. But yeah, okay, this is not an intermission. So, this is your solo bottle. So Cordis launches the angioplasty catheter, and we get sued by DuPont. DuPont said you're infringing the patents on the solo bottle. So, fascinatingly, the inventor of the solo bottle is polyethylene terephthalate. The inventor is Nathaniel Wyeth. Nathaniel's father is N.C. Wyeth, who was the illustrator for Robert Louis Stevenson and Jules Verne and many other very famous American artists. Nathaniel Wyeth's brother is Andrew Wyeth, which if you were to name the top 5 painters in the United States, his name will come up. This is just one of his paintings that you see over here. Nathaniel Wyeth's son, Howie Wyeth, was the drummer in Bob Dylan's band. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at that these people are, there's a little bit of a historical link, an inherited link, and let's talk about that a little further. This is my father, who's 93 right now, and there's a diversity of palettes. Now, he's been an entrepreneur his whole life. He's made his money as an entrepreneur. But he must have 1,000 paintings he's done over his career. I have one as early as when he was 13. And why does he paint? He doesn't sell his paintings, although they're hanging everywhere in the world. His palette is oil paints. But you get musicians musicians, guitar players, piano players, most of them don't get paid for doing that, but why don't they learn how to play the piano? Why do they learn how to play the guitar, etc.? Why don't people learn how to be chefs? A lot of them are homemakers. They're not really getting paid for that, but they enjoy that. You get your writers, your theater producers, etc. So what I found is if you're creative in any field, it means you have it within you to innovate. The important part about the outputters are they're going to be the ones who are going to reduce to practice their invention because they're not going to sit still and watch television. They're going to be thinking about how do I make this invention happen. Outputters means you have the drive and motivation to reduce your invention to practice. And as you talk to psychologists in this room, Dr. Greenfield and Dr. Prado, now they say, well, you're right-brained. That's typical right-brain. It's creativity. So my palette, is, although I do play in a band, I like tinkering in chemistry and in engineering. Self-motivated, driven by accomplishment, curious mind, outputter, not a TV watcher, not readily frustrated, very happy just thinking. Okay, so I mentioned why I have to go into ophthalmology. Those for the big bucks. Okay. Fortunately, UMiami has the Bascom Palmer Eye Institute. They're ranked number one for 21 years in a row. I would say, although they say it's in the U.S. the ranking, I would say it's worldwide. Excuse me, sir. And I've always worked with them on little projects because there's very few polymer chemists here in the city. So I asked them if they would check SIDS in the eye, and they put some in the stroma. The stroma is in the cornea, and without getting into detail, they found there's no tissue reaction when put in the lamina of the stroma. They also put a control group, which was a silicone rubber disc, under the conjunctiva. That's the clear layer that's over the white of the eye, which is the sclera. And you get a lot of blood vessels growing to nurture the capsule around silica. So you can always find out where it is. You see a lot of myofibroblasts, which are the progenitors of scar tissue with silicone. But they called me one day to say, your material degrades, your SIDS. I said, can't. They called me an hour later and said, we found it fell out of the eye. There's no capsule around it. There's nothing keeping it in the eye. They've never seen this before. So SIDS does not provoke neovascularization and capsule formation. No fire, no myofibroblasts. So we'll talk about the development of a shunt to stop glaucoma. And I would like to just acknowledge that I worked with people, great people, Jean-Marie Carrel, Bascom Palmer, the late Francisco Fantes, Richard Parrish, Paul Pomberg. So this wasn't just, by the way, none of this was just me. There's always a team of engineers and chemists and medical people. So we're going to talk about the eye. But if you're working in glaucoma, you're only really interested in the anterior part of the eye, where the cornea, the iris and lens are. So let's get rid of the back of the eye. Okay, so we're going to delete that, blow up the front of the eye. And because the eye is symmetrical all the way around, we're going to get rid of half of it. Look at the sagittal view, clear it up a little bit. And here you go. So you see the cornea, the iris, the lens, and this is what we're talking about. Okay, so we're going to look at drainage of the eye, but first you got to get fluid in the eye. So the ciliary body, it pumps aqueous humor. A humor is a clear fluid into the anterior chamber. And then it goes through what's called the trabecular meshwork into Slem's canal. And from Slem's canal it goes into the collector channels. And this goes all the way around the eye. Slem's canal is like a sewer. And then it goes into the veins in the white of the eye in the sclera. Most people live that way for their entire life. But sometimes with some people, you begin to get the drains become obstructed. So I'm just going to show some bricks being laid down. Where are you, bricks? I'm over here somewhere. There you go. And when you have this obstruction, you're still pumping into the eye, so your pressure is going to increase in the eye. But it's not draining the way it used to drain. So glaucoma is an increased pressure in the eye that can damage the optic nerve. And the only known means of stopping glaucoma is to lower the pressure in the eye. And there's about 70 million people blind due to glaucoma worldwide. So what we want to do is we take a little tube called the POSTULATE microshunt. It's made 100% out of the SIPS material I talked about that doesn't have this encapsulation tendency. We put a needle track through the bricks, and then we thread it through the needle track, and we begin to drain the fluid from the anterior chamber into the flap formed just above the sclera. And then that makes its way through the conjunctiva, and most of it goes into the tear film, or the episcleral veins, whichever is the path of least resistance. And we're able to really stop the, lower the pressure in the eye. We can reduce it to normal. And vision loss is thwarted. So here I have a question. I have a choice of showing actual eye surgery, which is a little difficult to watch, or I can show an animation. Anybody against showing real surgery, and you can look the other way if it bothers you. And if you're going to throw up, look backwards. Okay, I'll show the surgery because, it's kind of interesting. So we mark the spot on the white of the eye. And we take this little knife that we developed. It has 2 steps in it. So we make a small step, then a larger step. And we push that knife until it goes into the anterior chamber. You're going to see it next, coming out right about now. I'll be throwing up. Okay. So we take this out. And then we take this microshunt that I talked about, made out of SIMS, and we thread it through that needle track. And we're going to take that fin, and the fin is going to wedge into the larger pocket that we formed. The reason why you do that is you don't want it to migrate into the eye, and you want it actually get corked to prevent leakage from around it. So we're going to make sure that there's flow through it. And here we're just going to wick it. And we have a flow resistor here, which is going to keep the eye from deflating entirely. So once flow is confirmed, and we're wedged into that pocket, we'll pull the conjunctiva back over and suture it in place. Okay. This was the movie for the limbs, so didn't want to watch live stream. So here you have the microshunt on the right. Very flexible, very soft rubbery material. So it's biostable, minimizes the foreign-body reaction, soft and thermoforming. It conforms to the curvature of the eye, which is important. The lumen is designed to prevent hypotony or deflation. And those of us in engineering now understand why we had to take fluid dynamics, because that's where you learn about that equation. And it has a bevel to facilitate entry and visualize the lumen, fin to prevent migration and leakage around the tube. And it's tough and it's repairable. It's very important, because if it clogs up, you have to be able to repair it without damaging it. So the proof is in the pudding here, and you want to keep your pressure in the green zone between 5 and 15 millimeters of mercury. And we're able to do that. I'm showing you 5 years worth. We're on to 10 years now, but the paper hasn't been published at 10 years. So we're holding intraocular pressure about 12 millimeters, 80% of the patients off glaucoma meds, about an 80% success rate of doing this on the first shot. Medication regimen cut 75%. And a minuscule, very small percentage of these people actually had a decrease in vision. Most people are stabilized with this device. And it's changing the paradigm for treating of glaucoma. So the old procedure called trabeculectomy is not being practiced much in Europe where it is launched. The patients like it. You can wear contact lenses again. Follow-up is easy, predictable outcomes. It may reduce or remove the need for multiple eye drops. It can be reproduced in the same line with little trauma. And it halts the progression towards blindness. So we're approved in actually 33 countries as of last week. We've only started selling it 18 months ago. About 40,000 have been sold over the last 18 months. We're going to be in the hundreds of thousands in about 2 years. And the FDA, I won't use profanity at this talk here, but they're doing a certain thing. Okay, so it's not the only thing we're working on. We have a new type of lens for post-cataract surgery. And one of the things that happens with lenses, once you get the cataractus lens out of your eye, you have to put in a new lens. And there's a slow hazing that occurs with time, and you have this thing called listening. Virtually all intraocular lenses demonstrate listening or widening. It affects your glare and contrast sensitivity at night. Patients don't often know about it. But the ophthalmologists see it, and the regulators just don't like to see it. So we developed a new lens made out of polyisobutylene. So we have these styrene groups with the square circle, the square on the end. Square organic molecules are not stable. In the presence of heat, they open up, and here we can cross-link it. So in other words, it's not chewing gum anymore. We've chemically cross-linked all the segments together. So it becomes a resilient rubber. So the body interface is only carbon and hydrogen. There's no initiators or byproducts from the reaction. Nothing that can hydrolyze or oxidize. So we stop the glistening, we stop the hazing. Because it's rubbery, we can make it larger. If your lens is smaller than your pupil, you're going to see halos. And 10% of people who have intraocular lenses see halos at night. But if you make your lens larger than your pupil, it stops the halos. But you can't do that with conventional lenses because you can't introduce it any larger than 6 millimeters. It just doesn't fit in the incisions. And then again, those that took organic chemistry are not going to dwell on this. But these are, they call them acrylic lenses, but those organic chemists know they're really methacrylates, but they misname them. But you have these ester groups, and esters cleave in water, and this is what's causing the hazing. So if you get rid of all hydrolytically stable groups, you'll stop the hazing. We're also, I'm going to just show 2 more things that we're working on very seriously. Heart valves that are put in through catheters, we're eliminating the need to go in surgically. This is a stenotic heart valve in the aorta. So you build up calcium, and the valve can't open much. And if it can't open much, you're not going to perfuse the body. So you can go in with one of my nylon 12 angioplasty balloons and dilate it and break the calcium. Sometimes it's all you need to do. But what's happening now is they're putting these expanding stents. This is a balloon expandable stent, stainless steel usually. And they blow up the balloon here, and it deploys the stent. And then on the stent is a heart valve. And these heart valves are typically made out of porcine pericardium. That's the tissue surrounding the heart of pigs, or cows, or bovine. You're even beginning to use horse pericardium. So if you look at this, there's no surgery. It's done through the arteries in the groin. And you can now open to almost the full diameter. The problem is you can't compress bulging too small, so a lot of petite people can't get this procedure. Most women can't get this procedure. So the idea is to replace the pericardium with the subscript material. And we now have in the simulators, our valves on the far left, a company called Polynova. It's called TAVR, or transaortic valve replacement. We've exceeded 1 billion cycles. The FDA wants you to do 200 million. But they're, keeps on pumping. Okay, so here's the next thing. I almost finished my talk here. I got a call from a friend of mine who worked at Stryker. Stryker's the largest orthopedic company in the world. And they're looking at a synthetic meniscus in the knee made out of a synthetic polymer. So the guy calls me and he says, I don't want to call on the company, but he says, look what they're making the meniscus out of. The implant is composed of 2 biocompatible polymers, a polycarbonate urethane, and by the way, he said that's your biolane, circumferentially reinforced with ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene. Well, I showed earlier how polyethylene is going to oxidize and polycarbonate is not stable. So he says, you know how to fix it. Why don't you do another startup company and just develop an aid? You know how to stop the degradation. And by the way, if that works, you can do an HCL. So, I'm kind of planning towards retiring, but this is kind of an interesting challenge. And us inventors are not going to sit still until this is done. I don't want to dwell on this. It's just about it. Yeah, can we replace PCU with a biostable polyisobutylene-based polymer with similar strength? Yes, we can now make these with similar strength. This is, I like the saying. So I'm now checking to see how deep the water is before jumping off the diving board. I have to see if the iceberg has any money left. And there's lots of buyers for orthopedic companies. So let's conclude here. Leg 1, societal factors led to the development of angioplasty, stenting, drug-eluting stent graft, glaucoma devices, IOLs, catheters, etc. Tinkering led to resolving the problems with all of these. Led to this, and chasing hypotheses and basic science led to SIMS. SIMS was basic science. And taming the foreign body reaction. That led to the drug-eluting stent and the treatment for glaucoma. Leg 3, choose your parents wisely. You're creative in any field, it means you have it in you. But now you have to choose your palate wisely. And if you're an outputter, chances are you will reduce your invention to practice. And again, there's lots of people who help, many teams around the world. So thank you very much for your